My cousin Sienna walked out of my grandmother's hospital room with the emerald ring on her thumb. She was the only person in our family who could fit it on her thumb. The ring had belonged to my grandmother for 61 years. It had not left her hand in any photograph I had ever seen. Sienna walked it out of room 412, in the cardiac care unit at St. Vincent's, at 4:11 in the morning on the last day of my grandmother's life. The nurse on duty saw her do it. The nurse stopped her. Sienna told the nurse, with the kind of calm a person uses when they have already decided how a conversation is going to go, that the ring had been promised to her and that she was taking it home for safekeeping. The nurse did not stop her again. The nurse later told me that Sienna had said it like a person who already knew nobody was going to argue. The nurse did not feel like the right person to argue. The nurse went back to her station and noted the time and the item in the patient's chart, the way nurses do when something happens that may matter later. My grandmother died 73 minutes after that. I arrived at the hospital 20 minutes too late. I had been driving up from Connecticut, where I had been working the wedding rehearsal of a couple I had been planning for 7 months. The rehearsal had run long. My phone had been on silent. By the time I had seen the call from my mother, my grandmother had already been gone for 6 minutes. I sat in the parking lot of St. Vincent's at 4:50 in the morning, in a black dress I had not had time to change out of, with my work bag still on the passenger seat, and I cried in a way I have not cried since. When I went up to the room, Sienna was already gone. The ring was already gone. The nurses were doing what nurses do, which is move quietly and gently around bodies that have stopped being patients and started being someone's grandmother again. My mother told me about the ring 3 hours later, in the hallway, while we were waiting to sign paperwork. She told me Sienna had taken it. She told me Sienna had said it had been promised to her. My mother said the words, "She stole it," in a voice that was already shaking with the kind of rage that grief turns into when grief has nowhere else to go. My aunts arrived from upstate around the same time, and the rage spread through them like a small fire, and by the end of that morning, the family had collectively decided who Sienna was. Sienna was the cousin who had stolen our grandmother's ring from her dying hand. I want you to know who I am, before I tell you what I learned at the memorial 3 days later. My name is Cleo Marchetti. I am 29 years old. I am a wedding planner. I have spent the last 6 years of my life arranging the public moments of other people's families. I know what a family looks like when it is being staged for a camera, and I know what a family looks like when the cameras are off. I know the small lies people tell at weddings and at christenings and at memorials. I have heard them. I have heard them through doors. I have heard them in catering kitchens. I have heard them in bridal suites and in hotel hallways and in the quiet 10 minutes before a ceremony begins. What I heard at my grandmother's memorial 3 days after she died was not the kind of small lie I had been hearing all my career. It was the kind of sentence that ends one story and starts another. It came out of my cousin Sienna's mouth. It was meant for somebody else. I overheard it. What I am going to tell you about that sentence and about what came after is not the story I thought I was going to tell when I walked into my parents' house that day. The story I thought I was going to tell was a revenge story. The story turned out to be something else. I am going to try to tell it the way I learned it. Before I do, hit subscribe. And tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a moment when you realized that somebody in your family who you had judged was actually carrying something you had not been able to see. Tell me how old you were when you found out. Tell me what changed for you afterward. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to my grandmother's house and to the woman who had been quietly built into our family for 34 years without anybody really seeing her. I want to tell you about my grandmother first because the rest of this story does not work without her. My grandmother's name was Loretta Marchetti. She was 82 when she died. She had been born in a small town outside Naples in 1942. She had emigrated to the United States in 1959 when she was 17, with her parents and a younger brother. She had met my grandfather Giancarlo at a church festival in the Bronx the following year. They had married in 1962 when she was 20. They had bought a small house in suburban Connecticut in 1965, and they had lived in it for 58 years until the morning my grandfather died of a heart attack in the kitchen in the spring of 2018, and my grandmother had stayed in the house alone for the 6 years after that. My grandmother had been the warm center of our family for as long as I had been alive. She had been the one who kept everybody connected. She had hosted Sunday dinners every week until my grandfather died, and even after, although the dinners had gotten smaller after he was gone. She had remembered every birthday. She had bought every grandchild a small gold cross when they were baptized. She had been, for me, the person I had been closest to in the world. The ring my cousin had walked out of the hospital with had been my grandfather's gift to her on their 10th anniversary. It was a square emerald set in old gold, with two small diamonds on either side. My grandmother had worn it on her right hand. She had worn it through every photograph of every family event since 1972. She had told me when I was a teenager that the ring was going to come to one of her granddaughters someday, but that she had not yet decided which one. She had said it the way grandmothers say things they have not actually thought through. I had assumed for years that the ring would go to whichever granddaughter had the closest relationship with her at the end. I had assumed, in a small private corner of my own mind, that the granddaughter would probably be me, because I had been the one who came over on Saturdays, and the one who took her to her appointments, and the one who slept in the spare bedroom whenever she had a small surgery to recover from. I had not been the granddaughter who walked the ring out of the hospital. The granddaughter who had walked the ring out of the hospital had been Sienna. I want to tell you about Sienna because Sienna is the part of this story that I had been wrong about my whole life. Sienna is 34 years old. She was, until the afternoon of the memorial, my cousin. She was, by the official version of our family tree, the daughter of my grandmother's younger sister, Beatrice. Beatrice had married a man named Robert Hollander in the late 1980s and had moved to a small town in Pennsylvania. Sienna had been raised there. She had moved back to Connecticut in her 20s and had become, slowly and without anyone really noticing, more present in our family than she had been when she had lived 4 hours away. She had started showing up at Sunday dinners about 9 years ago, around the time my grandfather had died. She had taken my grandmother out to lunch most Tuesdays. She had been the one who had driven my grandmother to her doctor's appointments after my grandmother had given up driving. She had become, in the last years of my grandmother's life, the family member who saw her most often. I had not been jealous of Sienna. I had been busy. I had been building my career. I had let Sienna do the visits I could not always do, and I had told myself that my Saturdays were the meaningful contribution, even though I had not been able to maintain my Saturdays as consistently as I had wanted to. I had been grateful to Sienna, in a quiet way, for picking up the slack that I had not been able to pick up. When my mother had told me, in the hallway of the hospital, that Sienna had taken the ring, the gratitude had instantly converted into something else. It had converted into a rage I had not known I had been capable of. It had converted into a story I had immediately understood. The way you understand a story when you have been raised inside the kind of family that uses jealousy as currency. The story had been simple. Sienna had spent the last 9 years positioning herself for this moment. She had been kind to my grandmother in order to acquire her possessions. She had taken the ring while my grandmother was unconscious. She had said the ring had been promised to her, knowing nobody could disprove it, knowing my grandmother could not be asked. She had been a thief in a long con, and the ring was her payday. I want to tell you that I held on to that story for 3 days. I want to tell you that I let the rage build. I want to tell you that I went into the memorial on Saturday afternoon, 3 days after my grandmother had died, with my arms crossed and my jaw set and a plan to confront Sienna in front of the entire family. I did not get to confront her. I overheard her instead. The memorial was at my parents' house, in the suburb of Connecticut where my grandmother had lived for 58 years. My grandmother had not wanted a church service. She had asked, in a will my mother had read out loud the night before, that we gather at her house, the small ranch on Cedar Avenue, with food and wine and music she had specifically chosen. We had honored that. About 60 people came. My aunts and uncles, cousins and second cousins, old friends from the neighborhood, my grandmother's hairdresser, who had been doing her hair for 30 years and who had cried into a cocktail napkin in my mother's kitchen for almost an hour. The priest from St. Anthony's, who had baptized me and who had buried my grandfather, and who had now buried my grandmother and who was getting older every time I saw him. The catering had been done by a small Italian restaurant in town that my grandmother had loved, and the food was the food she had always ordered there, and the smell of it in the house had made everyone cry at different points throughout the afternoon. Sienna arrived around 2 in the afternoon. She came with her mother, my great-aunt Beatrice, who at 76 had insisted on coming despite her bad hip. Sienna helped Beatrice into the house and into a chair in the living room, near the fireplace. She kissed my mother on the cheek. She nodded at my aunts. The aunts, who had been talking about her in the kitchen for 2 days, stopped talking when she came in. The room got that particular kind of quiet that only happens when everybody is suddenly trying very hard not to look at the same person. Sienna sat next to her mother. She did not approach me. She did not approach my mother. She sat quietly. She did not have the ring on her hand or her thumb or anywhere visible. She was wearing a simple black dress and a small gold cross on a chain. I watched her for almost an hour. I was waiting for her to say something. I was waiting for her to acknowledge what she had done. I was waiting for any kind of opening that would let me, finally, walk over and ask her in front of everybody to explain herself. She did not say anything. She held my great-aunt's hand. She accepted condolences from a few neighbors who did not know the story yet. She drank 1 glass of red wine. She helped a small cousin reach a tray of cookies on the coffee table. She did everything you would do at a memorial if you were a person who had loved the woman whose memorial it was, and who had nothing to apologize for. I could feel my anger getting more confused as the afternoon went on. The version of Sienna I had been telling myself a story about for 3 days did not match the version of Sienna I was watching across the room. The Sienna in my head had been calculating, sharp, smug. The Sienna in my mother's living room was a woman in mourning, sitting next to her own mother, holding her hand, looking out the window at the small garden my grandmother had spent 40 years tending to. I went into the kitchen around 3:30 to refill my water glass. The kitchen was empty. The catering staff had gone outside to take a break. My mother was somewhere in the dining room with her sisters. The kitchen had a small archway that opened into the back hallway, and the back hallway led to the small den my grandmother had used as her sewing room, and from where I was standing at the sink, I could hear voices coming from the den. The voices were Sienna and my great-aunt Beatrice. They were not loud. They were the kind of voices people use when they think they are alone in a room, in a house full of other people who are busy with their own grief. I would have walked past them. I would not have listened. I had not been the kind of person who eavesdropped. But Sienna said something I could not unhear. She said it quietly. She said it to her mother. She said, "Mom, I told you she would let me have it. She finally said it before she died. She told me it was mine. She told me to take it off her hand and put it on mine. She had been waiting to say it for years." My great-aunt Beatrice said something I could not quite hear. Then she said more clearly, "Sienna, you did the right thing. She would have wanted you to have it." Sienna said, "I know, Mom. I know." I stood in the kitchen with my water glass in my hand. I did not move. I do not know how long I stood there. The two of them did not say anything else for a few minutes, and then I heard them shift, and Sienna walked back through the kitchen on her way to the living room. She saw me. She nodded politely. She did not know I had heard her. She kept walking. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment because the feeling was not what I had expected. I had expected, when I finally caught Sienna in some confirmation of her crime, to feel rage. I had been ready for rage. I had been carrying rage for 3 days. What I felt instead, standing in my mother's kitchen with the water glass in my hand, was confusion. The confusion had a specific shape. It was the shape of a woman who had just heard another woman say words that did not match the story I had been telling myself. The words I had heard had not been the words of a thief. They had been the words of a daughter. Specifically, they had been the words of a daughter who had been waiting for a long time to hear something from a parent who had been finally able to give it to her at the very end. I want you to think about that for a second. The phrase, "I told you she would let me have it," is not a thief's phrase. A thief does not need a parent's permission. A thief does not phrase a theft as a wait. The phrase, "she finally said it before she died," is not a phrase about an inheritance. It is a phrase about a confession. The phrase, "she told me to take it off her hand and put it on mine," is not the language of an opportunity. It is the language of a transfer that had been planned for a long time, by both people involved, with witnesses neither of them had wanted at the moment. I stood in the kitchen for another 5 minutes. I made a decision. I did not go into the den to confront my great-aunt. I did not run to my mother to tell her what I had overheard. I went back into the living room and I waited. I waited for almost 2 more hours. The memorial slowly thinned out. People left in waves. By 6 in the evening, most of the family was gone. Sienna was helping her mother to the door. I caught Sienna's eye. I made a small gesture with my hand that meant, "Come find me." She nodded. She helped Beatrice to her car. She came back into the house 10 minutes later, alone. I led her into the small den, the same den where she had been speaking to her mother. I closed the door. I said, "Sienna, I need to ask you a question. I need you to tell me the truth. I am not asking it as a member of this family. I am asking it as a person who deserves to understand something that I think I do not understand." She looked at me. She looked at the door. She looked back at me. She said, "Cleo, ask." I said, "Who are you to my grandmother?" She did not answer for a long time. She walked over to the small chair my grandmother used to sit in to thread her sewing needles. She sat down in it. She put her hands in her lap. She said, "I had been waiting for somebody to ask me that for 9 years." She told me everything that night. We sat in that den for almost 3 hours. My mother came in once to ask if I needed anything. I told her I was fine. She left. Sienna told me the story of who she actually was. I want to tell it to you the way she told it to me, because the order of the telling matters. My grandmother had been pregnant once before she had married my grandfather. She had been 17. She had still been in Italy. She had been pregnant by a boy from a town 3 miles away who had not married her, who had left for Argentina before she had been able to tell him. She had carried the baby. She had given birth to a daughter on a Tuesday in the spring of 1959, 3 months before she had emigrated to the United States with her parents. The baby had not come with her. The baby had been given up to a Catholic adoption agency in Naples. The agency had placed the baby with a family in the United States. The placement had been a closed adoption. My grandmother had never been told who had adopted her daughter. She had emigrated 3 months later with her parents as planned, with the family pretending she had simply been ill that winter. She had married my grandfather 2 years after that. She had not told him about the daughter she had given up. She had decided before the wedding that the secret was hers to carry, because the alternative would have been losing him, and at 20 years old she had not been able to imagine that. She had carried the secret for 46 years. She had never told my grandfather. She had never told her own children. She had never told anybody in our family. She had assumed, for 46 years, that her first daughter had grown up somewhere in America, with a different name and a different family, and that she would never know what had happened to her. In 2005, when Sienna had been 25 years old, Sienna had taken a DNA test. Sienna had grown up with 2 adoptive parents in Pennsylvania who had adopted her as a baby through a Catholic agency, who had told her she was adopted from a young Italian woman who had given her up shortly after birth. Sienna had grown up curious. The DNA test had matched her with 2 cousins who lived in Connecticut. Sienna had reached out to them. The cousins had introduced her to the rest of the family. The family had, with a great deal of care, eventually arranged a meeting between Sienna and the woman they had begun to suspect might be her biological mother. The woman had been my grandmother. My grandmother had met Sienna at a small restaurant in New Haven on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 2005. They had been introduced by my grandmother's older sister, who was the only person in the family who had known about the original pregnancy, and who had figured out when the DNA results had been shared that the daughter she had been keeping a secret about for 46 years had finally come back. My grandmother and Sienna had cried in that restaurant. They had stayed for almost 6 hours. They had decided by the end of that meeting that they were going to know each other. They had also decided that they were not going to tell my grandfather. My grandfather had been 72 years old in 2005. He had been a good man, but a traditional one. My grandmother had not believed he could survive the truth. She had spent 2 years trying to find a way to tell him. She had not found one. He had died in 2018, when my grandmother had been 76 and Sienna had been 38, and even after he had died, my grandmother had not been able to tell the rest of us. She had not been able to tell us, Sienna explained, for the same reason she had not told my grandfather. My grandmother had been carrying shame about it. She had been 17. She had been pregnant. She had given a child away. She had built her entire identity in the United States around being the woman she had married my grandfather as. The original girl, the one who had given a baby to nuns in Naples in 1959, had been a person my grandmother had spent 60 years trying not to be. Sienna's existence had been the only proof that the original girl had ever existed at all. My grandmother had loved Sienna. She had also been terrified of what Sienna's existence meant about her. The terror had won, every year, for the entire 9 years she had been seeing Sienna in our family. She had introduced Sienna to the family as a niece. She had asked Beatrice, who had become Sienna's adoptive mother's friend years earlier in a small chain of coincidences I did not need to fully understand to follow, to be the cover story. Beatrice had agreed. Beatrice had loved my grandmother her whole life. Beatrice had been willing to be the person Sienna's official family tied to, in exchange for my grandmother getting to spend the rest of her life knowing her own daughter, even if it had to be from inside a lie. The ring, Sienna told me, had been the only thing my grandmother had ever explicitly promised to her. My grandmother had told Sienna, on the night of their first meeting in 2005, that the ring would be hers someday. My grandmother had said it had been the only thing she had been able to keep from her old life in Italy, and that she had brought it with her on the boat in 1959, and that it had been the one piece of her original self that she had carried into her American life. She had wanted Sienna to have it because she had wanted Sienna to have, from her birth mother, the only object her birth mother had been able to keep from the time before her. In the cardiac care unit at St. Vincent's, 8 hours before she had died, my grandmother had asked Sienna to stay with her after the rest of the family had gone home for the night. She had told Sienna she did not have much time. She had taken the ring off her hand. She had put it on Sienna's thumb, the only finger of Sienna's it could fit. She had said in Italian, the language she had not spoken regularly in 50 years, "Take it home. It is yours. I love you. Tell nobody. The secret is mine to keep, even now. Promise me you will let them think what they want to think." Sienna had promised. She had taken the ring. She had walked out of the room at 4:11 in the morning. The nurse had stopped her in the hallway. Sienna had given the only answer she had been allowed to give, which was that the ring had been promised to her and that she was taking it home for safekeeping. The nurse had let her go. My grandmother had died 73 minutes later. Sienna told me all of this in the den. She showed me letters. She showed me a folder of photographs. She showed me a small DNA test result printout from 2005 with my grandmother's name on it, identifying her as the closest relative match. She showed me a copy of a hospital record from Naples, dated April 14, 1959, that listed a Loretta Marchetti, age 17, as the mother of a baby girl placed for adoption that day. She showed me everything. When she had finished, she said, "Cleo, I have not told anybody what I just told you. Beatrice knows, my adoptive parents know, my husband knows, that is everybody. Your grandmother asked me, on the last night of her life, to let the rest of the family keep believing what they had always believed about who I was. She asked me to take the ring without explaining it. She asked me to be the cousin who took the ring, instead of the daughter she could not introduce. She did not want her sons to find out, after she was dead, that she had hidden a child for 46 years. She thought it would be too much for them. She loved them. She wanted to leave them with the version of her they had grown up with. The thief at the funeral was easier to give them than the truth. I sat in the den and I did not say anything for a long time. My grandmother's sewing basket was still in the corner. The thread spools were exactly where she had left them. I could hear, somewhere on the other side of the door, my mother and her sisters putting away the leftover food in plastic containers and quietly arguing about who was going to take the ham home. I asked Sienna one question. I asked her what she wanted me to do with what she had just told me. She said, "Cleo, I am not asking you for anything. I am telling you because you asked. You are the only person in this family who asked me directly who I was. Most people would have been content with the rage. You came in here. You asked. So I told you. What you do with it is yours. But I want you to know that, if you choose to keep what your grandmother asked me to keep, I will not be angry. I will not feel cheated. The ring is enough. The years I had with her were enough. I do not need this family to call me their aunt now. I needed her to call me her daughter, and she did, in the only ways she could, for 9 years. I stood up. I walked over to the chair she was in. I knelt down in front of her. I took her hands. I said, "Sienna, you have been my aunt for 34 years. I am going to need some time to figure out what to call you out loud." She started crying. I started crying. We held each other on the floor of my grandmother's sewing room for a long time. I want to tell you what I have decided to do because the decision is the only part of this story that is mine alone. I have not told my mother. I have not told my aunts. I have not told my brother. I have not told anyone in the official family. The story they are still being told, 8 months after the memorial, is the story of the cousin who took the ring. I have let them keep telling it. I have let my mother be quietly angry at Sienna. I have let my aunts make small comments at family dinners. I have not corrected them. I have done what my grandmother asked Sienna to ask me to do, even though my grandmother did not know she was asking me, because she did not know I would ever find out. I have done it because I made a decision. The decision was that my grandmother had earned, by living 73 years inside a secret she could not bring herself to share, the right to control what happened to that secret after she was gone. She had not asked me to keep her secret because she had not known I would learn it. But Sienna had asked me, and Sienna was the person who had paid the price for the secret for 34 years of her life, and for 9 years of having to call her own mother by the wrong word in public. Sienna got to decide. I was going to honor what Sienna decided. Sienna and I see each other in private now. We have lunch every other Sunday at a small restaurant in the next town over. I call her my cousin in front of my family. I call her something else, in my own head, when we are alone. We are figuring out what we are to each other. We are the only two people who hold the truth of what my grandmother actually was, and the holding has made us, in our own way, what my grandmother would have wanted us to be. We are not telling the family. We have agreed on this. The cost of telling at this point would fall on my uncles, who are in their 70s, who would have to spend the rest of their own lives reorganizing their memories of their mother. My grandmother did not want that. Sienna does not want that. I do not want it either. The truth in this case is not a thing that needs to be made public to be real. The truth is real between the two of us. It will be real between the two of us for the rest of our lives. Sienna wears the ring sometimes. She wears it on her thumb, the way my grandmother had it on her hand the last night of her life. When my mother sees Sienna at family events, my mother makes a small face. My mother thinks Sienna is wearing it to provoke us. Sienna is not. Sienna is wearing it because it was her mother's, and because it is now hers, and because the act of wearing it, even in front of family who think she stole it, is a small private way of honoring a woman who could not honor her in public. I let my mother make her face. I do not say anything. The cost of the ring in our family is going to be the small, ongoing rage at my cousin who took it. I have decided that the cost is acceptable. The price is a low one in exchange for what my grandmother was able to give Sienna at the end of her life. The price is also low compared to what would be lost on the other side, if the truth came out. My grandmother's careful 63 years of being one specific person to her family, my uncle's image of their mother, my aunt's assumption that they had known her completely. All of those things were built on a foundation that, it turns out, had a hidden room in it. The room is going to stay hidden. The two of us are going to live in it together, in our own way. I want to tell you what I have learned because I think it is the part that may be useful to somebody else. Some secrets are kept because the keeper is bad. Some are kept because the keeper has been told, by the people they love, that telling would cost them everything. The same secret can be a wound or a kindness depending on who is forced to carry it. Before you decide who is the villain in a story, find out which family member has been paying the price for the silence. The thief at the funeral is sometimes the only person who has been telling the truth about themselves the whole time. The good cousin, the responsible grandchild, the one with the right opinions, may turn out to have been the one who could afford to look good because somebody else was carrying the actual weight of the family's secrets. I had spent 3 days believing my cousin had stolen a ring. I had been ready to confront her. I had been ready to make her the villain of a story I had already written in my head. The story was wrong. The story had been wrong because I had not asked one question, which was the question of who Sienna actually was. And I had not asked it because I had not realized, until I was standing in my mother's kitchen overhearing her talk to her own mother, that there was a different version of the story available to me. I want you to ask the question. If somebody in your family has been doing something that does not quite make sense, and the story everybody is telling about them feels too simple, ask the harder question. Find out what they have been carrying. Find out who they are when nobody is watching them perform the role the family assigned them. Most of us are playing a role somebody else cast us in. The roles are sometimes wrong. Sometimes the person you have been judging is a person who has been living inside a small secret that has cost them everything they have not been allowed to publicly claim. You may not be able to fix it. You may not be able to expose it. You may decide after you find out that the cost of telling is too high, and that the kindest thing you can do is hold the secret with the person who has been carrying it. The carrying becomes lighter when it is shared. That, I have learned, is also a form of love. I want to ask you something before you go. Tell me in the comments the moment you realized that a person you had judged in your family was actually carrying something you could not see. Tell me how you found out. Tell me what you decided to do with what you learned. Tell me whether you told anyone. Tell me whether the silence has been heavy for you, or whether it has been a kind of love. There are more of us holding family secrets gently than the family members we are holding them for would ever know. Tell me yours. I want to read every single one. I will see you in the next one.